I'm very excited to be here. I'm a former United Way staff member and exec, and I'm in Southern Maine. So without further ado, I'd love to hand it off to our presenter today, Betsy Block.
Hi, it was nice to meet all of you. I'm going to pop up slides because that's what presenters do. We get our slides going, and hopefully I will share the right screen like I've done this before. So hopefully you are all seeing my slides now, and I'm still seeing you. And you're excited to hear today about doing conflict on purpose in service of innovation, which maybe some of you are really excited about, and some of you are going, but you're here anyway. So you can tell I've had a couple of cups of coffee. Just a quick note about me. You've probably seen a link to my bio and read a little bit about me. I am also former United Way of the Bay Area. I was in charge of evaluation and research out there for a couple years, and definitely a place where I got to see a lot of interesting conversations about conflict. The other thing I want you to know about me is that I'm really passionate about catalyzing teams. Often an uncomfortable process, but a really amazing process. Um, Sometimes leaders get a lot of attention, but the teams get less attention. And that's where I work as a systemic team coach. Um, if you ever get curious about all the letters after my name, I'm more than happy to explain them. But otherwise, they're all letters that say that that's what I'm passionate about. So just to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what we're going to cover today, here's what I hope to cover and hope that you will all hold me accountable to. We're going to make sure that we define what we mean when we say conflict. I think there's a lot of misconception about that, and so we'll work through making sure that we're sharing a definition of conflict. We're also going to make a case about why it matters in the nonprofit sector. Like, you actually want this because we need to be innovating, and let's talk about why. And just make that connection so that it feels like it's purposeful. The next thing I want to cover is to make sure that at some point we make space to talk about prerequisites for healthy conflict, because there are times to do this and there are times that you don't. And we want to make sure we know what those times are. I'm going to give you at least one framework to think about what healthy conflict is for the teams that you work with and support, or the organizations that you run, and how to make sure that you're watching for those signals of where things can often go toxic, and noticing that difference between the toxic, destructive stuff and the constructive, useful stuff. And I'm going to hopefully give you a couple of tools that make you feel really confident about doing this in your organization. And you all are professionals that have been at this a while, and you may know of stuff I don't know about. So we'll definitely make sure that we make some space for sharing and thinking about that. One thing I am going to do, and this is going to require a little bit of imagination, but I often talk about systemic coaching, and I want to give you a sense of what I mean when I talk about systemic views of teams. So I want you to imagine that you have a piece of string. And if you imagine what you might be doing with that string and holding it or looking at it or tying it into a knot, or for those of us that remember childhood, of creating that little web with our fingers of the cat's cradle or the ladder, whatever you called it, that's emotional intelligence. Your ability to have a conversation with yourself about what's going on with that string and what you're doing with that string. Then you might look at somebody else on this Zoom and say, oh, that person has a string. I want to tie our strings together. And you imagine what that conversation would be, and the eye contact and exchange that you have with that person, and what it is to link those strings together. Do you knot them? Who takes charge? What's that dance between the two of you to create that knot? That is relationship intelligence, right? The ability to have that relationship. But if you imagine that everybody on the Zoom has a piece of string, and that you're all trying to knot it together, and you start to imagine Paul's got a string, and Angie's got a string, and Dana's got a string, and Jennifer's got a string, and Amanda's got a string, And somebody, and we're going to start putting them together to create a web that holds something. And you can imagine what that web across all of these little Zoom icons looks like, this crazy web of string, and it's going to hold something. And what those conversations would be like, and those interactions would be like, that ends up creating this web. And all of a sudden you can imagine a web across all of our little Zoom squares. That's systemic relationship stuff, relationship systems. And that web that it creates in the middle, that's the systemic view. And so one of the things to kind of note, and it's just a concept that's important to understanding when we talk about conflict and when we talk about what's happening on teams, to know that there's this web that holds us all together, and the system has its own health. And as you are, so that's, pause for 1 second. Relationship systems intelligence is the term that comes here. So I'll just type that into the chat. Relationship systems intelligence, or RSI. And oftentimes when we're thinking about systemic health, we're talking about RSI. And I want to encourage you, as we're going through how healthy is my team and what's its ability to sustain something like conflict, you have some kind of way of measuring health or thinking about health. The tool that I most frequently use is something called a team diagnostic, created by Team Coaching International. And this is kind of a shorthand view of what it looks like to think about team health. And what in some way I do with teams is get them to think about, how would you rate trust on your team, right? Is it Midland 5 or 6, or is it really healthy at an 8? Oh, sorry, supposed to be annotating here. There we go. Is it really healthy at an 8? Right? What's optimism like? Maybe it's kind of low right now because times are rough. Still okay, hanging in there. Maybe you're here because the ability to have constructive interaction or have these really difficult conversations feels low, right? Like, we really communicate well, right? And we love working together. That's really our strong suit. We're pretty good, but we could be better about hearing different opinions. We have a lot of respect for each other. We're feeling kind of low on resources. Decision making, not so great. We kind of put that off. We're super aligned and very accountable, and we have strong leadership, clear goals. We're really proactive. And this is a wheel of health, right? And it's just kind of a snapshot in time of what the health of your team looks like, so that as you start to have conversations about what's possible with your team, you're doing it from a perspective of knowing, where are the strengths of my team that I can lean into, and where are the challenges or struggles going to hit that I need to think about, and how we're going to approach bringing in conflict and really working towards innovation. So as Ivy said in the chat, I've got a download for you to play with this. And at the end, I'll talk about, there's actually a version of this inventory, of an inventory that creates a more nuanced and not academic, but there's actual diagnostic behind this. But this is a nice thing to kind of play with in your head, to think about, what can I anticipate might happen with my team when I start to introduce this. So anyway, I'll take a breath for a second before I move on. But again, this is a resource that's available to you, and something that might just kind of help you preview and think about where the team is, and heading into an aspirational conflict kind of thing. Cool. All right, first tool out the gate. All right. So, question to all of you, which I would love to see your answers in the chat. How do you define conflict? I'd love to see the chat come alive with, I don't know, let's try to get at least 5 or 6 different versions of, what do you define as conflict? One of my favorite things to do. Every once in a while, somebody nails it, the definition that I like to cling to, but I love seeing the different definitions in here. Oh, growth. Okay, growth could be conflict. Difference of opinion on how to handle something or an issue, great. Disagreement, uncomfortability, perspective, an abrasive difference of opinions. Ooh, thank you for throwing that in there. Difference in values. Oh, that's awesome. Unwillingness to accept a different opinion as actual. Stressful. So we're getting not only definitions, but also like the connection, what it brings up in us, right? That this can be stressful. So difference in thinking. That's great. Thank you. This is really helpful. I want you to notice in a lot of these definitions that some of them lean into like it's discomfort, it's stressful. There are these reactions to what happens when conflict shows up. Some people are leaning into like this is about growth, expansion of perspective, and a lot of noticing that it's difference of opinion. The definition that I like to bring to teams here that I want to offer to you is surfacing seemingly incompatible ideas. Surfacing seemingly incompatible ideas. What's important about this definition is a couple of things. One is the surface, right? We're allowing something to enter, right? Incompatible. These things can't exist at the same time. Seemingly, the word seemingly is great here, right? Surfacing seemingly incompatible ideas. It seems like you can't do these things at the same time, or these things can't coexist peacefully. And the ideation part of it, right? We're trying to be generative here. So a lot of times I bring up the idea of conflict of like trying to decide where to go to dinner. It's unlikely you can go to 2 restaurants at once. But then again, maybe you can go one place for an appetizer and one place for an entree and someplace else for dessert. Maybe they can coexist. And oftentimes I have to remind people like trying to decide where to go to dinner can be a conflict, right? Because at first it doesn't seem like you can go all the places to dinner at once. And usually that doesn't have people feel up in arms, right? This is often where I talk about that people often say they're conflict averse. And we are averse to the kind of conflict that's disruptive and yelling and uncomfortable. But we engage in conflict all the time. And a lot of times it feels easy, but we may not recognize that we're in conflict because it's not eliciting all these emotions. So we're going to get really clear about what's destructive and what's constructive, what's useful. I do want to notice, and this is probably, I wrote this slide, I first started talking about this slide a couple years ago, and now it feels even, it just keeps getting more relevant. But one thing that's really helpful is to think about what type of conflict that we're having, right? Are we having a interpersonal conflict, right? Where it's more like, I don't like your style. Communication styles often come in here, right? I don't talk the way you talk. I'm more open than you are. I'm more closed than you are. I'm more direct. And so a lot of things come up in this relationship category. This conflict is kind of hard to be constructive because it's very personal. That's the interpersonal stuff and how we have relationship, you know, our styles, our personalities. What is it? People often say I'm too extra, and you know, it's hard to, you know, talk to me because I'm so extra. Well, that's personality, and that is a tough place to have conflict. There's also values conflict, and this one we hear so much right now. This is religion, politics, ethics. That's values-based conflict. And that zone of where that's healthy is really hard to get to. That often gets destructive because it's taboo, especially in the workplace, right? To talk about religion, to talk about politics. People are often very entrenched and distrustful of people that don't share their values and that perspective. So values-based conflict is a type of conflict. When you realize you're there, just know it's often really hard to move into a constructive place from there. But task-based conflict, task is when you're talking about a concrete thing at hand. How are we going to get a resource? How are we going to accomplish something? What does the policy or procedure need to be? What's the expectation at work? How do we interpret a set of facts? These are things that you might classify as task-based conflicts. And these, when in this presentation today, I'm really focusing on that kind of conflict that serves this type of work, right? How do we navigate complex, deeply rooted things? How do we identify underlying positions in service of coming to a better place on a policy, coming to a better place on design of something that we need to have exist in a concrete fashion? So I just want to note that there are all these different types of things, and there's bleeding between them, and there's other kinds of stuff. Sometimes your task reflects values. Sometimes the tasks get harder because of the interpersonal. But to really notice, what is it you're working on? What is the type of conflict that you're trying to go after on purpose? Making sure that you stay focused on the task piece of this is one key in making sure that it leans into constructive. There are dynamics that are going to show up, and I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways, but I really want to notice that things that show up in conflict that are really difficult that make it more difficult to navigate on purpose, right? Generational differences. Gen X, Boomer come at it different than Gen Z, Millennial. I don't know how true this is, but I know it shows up, and we also make up stories about it. So it doesn't matter how real it is because we have stories about it being real. Socioeconomic difference, class difference, power differences, right? It's really hard to have healthy conflict if you've got somebody really senior in the room and somebody really junior in the room, because there's going to be some automatic deference when power is there. If you have, for those of you in the United Ways that try to do strong community engagement, and you have donors and philanthropy in the room with people who are beneficiary of services, and there's a big socioeconomic and sometimes racial piece at play, really hard to create constructive conflict on purpose. Not impossible, but you have to be aware of and navigate that. Trauma, huge for me. Trauma is being trauma informed about what it means to bring conflict into a space. One of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about what's a good conflict area for a team, how does it healthy? Presence of trauma really informs that. You can't make assumptions about who has and hasn't experienced trauma, but be really aware that some people, yelling isn't going to be triggering for them. For other people, yelling sure will be triggering for them, and they're going to shut down. For some people, that hot button to having their nervous system get hijacked by conflict, that button's really available. Other people are I used to work for a Middle Eastern software company back in the early 90s when people could get away with things that they shouldn't get away with now. And I would sit in the room and watch people yell at each other and be like, I think this is right. I think this is right. And then they would be like, okay, that was interesting. Want to go out for a beer? You coming over Saturday night to see the family? It was nothing. That wouldn't fly in a lot of contexts that I see today. Different experience of trauma, different agreement about what stuff is. Another thing that comes up is how work is distributed. Just people who are more burdened may feel less confident about engaging in conflict than people who are feeling free and easy about what's on their plate or what type of work people are doing. A team that I'm working with right now is doing a lot of emotional labor, working in highly traumatized settings, and the manager's not there, and the manager wants to have more challenging conversations, And the team is like, we're emotionally done because of the type of work that we do and how we're spread doing it. So all of these things, both the type of conflict that we're having, as well as all of these attributes, and I'm sure you can probably think of some others, these impact our ability to identify where our healthy conflict zone is going to be. Okay. Anybody have, if you can think of something else that you know that's highly impactful to the ability to have healthy conflict, feel free to share it in the chat. And I know that with Ivy and Barb, we'll kind of lift that stuff up, or, you know, I've got a website we're going to share later, and I'll update or share some things here with you to add that to the brain trust that's here. There's a few terms we don't have to call conflict. Constructive conflict is a useful term, but there's also Brene Brown, we all love, talks about, well, I don't know that we all love her, I do, talks about rumbling, the importance of rumbling. Natanya Lee in the queer Black feminist facilitator arena talks about principled struggle. If you have any other names that you think of when you think about what good conflict is, those are helpful names to share, because sometimes a really important on-ramp to this is making sure we have a name that we can call it that gets people excited to lean into it. I'm going to come back to principled struggle in a few slides and explain what that's about. But yeah, if there's any other names for things that you have coming up, I'd love that. Okay. I wish this was 2 hours, because then I could harvest all of your wisdom and bring it forward, because you all have seen so much. And I don't want to step on that. And also, I'm supposed to finish in an hour. I do want to stop and make the case for innovation. And Ivy's going to queue up a poll, which is misleadingly labeled poll 2. But I have a question for you. Who's more creative, a group or an individual? Oh, I'm so excited.
And it looks like we've already got almost 80% participation, so I'll give it a couple more seconds.
Couple more seconds. According to psychological research, who is more creative? All right. I think this is indicative. I think we can end the poll and share it back. All right. So you say, or 85% of you say that a group is more creative than an individual. All right. So hold on to that thought. We can go ahead and take that down. Thank you. So actually, it's an individual. And if you think about this, you know that sometimes people kind of get swayed by the highest paid person in the room, or the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, that sometimes that person will speak and everybody will shut down. Because, as Kitty says in the chat, people will sink to groupthink. And in fact, a group will produce half the number of ideas, half the number of ideas as an individual, unless dissent is encouraged. That regression to the hippo, regression to groupthink, if dissent is not supported in the room, it shuts new ideas down. And groups are going to be less creative than individuals in that case. Half the number of ideas as an individual. There was a 2022 study in nonprofits specifically that talked about like the different styles of how we get ideas going in the room. And one of the things I want to note is that nonprofit, we're very mission-minded. We over-index on connection. We over-index on agreeing because we want harmony. And we instinctively assume that ruffling feathers and coming into conflict, like going toe to toe on stuff, is the antithesis of it. And I'm going to debunk that in just a little bit. So if you have a culture that supports risk taking, that supports conflict, it actually creates trust, right? You have to be in a more trusting environment for people to feel like they can bring conflict in, right? There was a study in Alabama back in 2005 that said if we focus on sharing culture so much, we're not going to innovate, because we're in an environment that's focused on stability and security, predictability, rule orientation, team orientation, and we forget to bring out those skills that allow for innovation, which is I got to take risks, I got to buck, I got to rock the boat a little bit. So you want, if you are indexing on stability and security as a way of generating trust, you're missing the opportunity to create trust through letting people take risks with each other individually. I have a whole separate conversation I love about, like, you don't build trust, you choose it, and all this stuff, which hopefully I'll get to talk to you about some other time. But dissent is really important if you want to bring out great ideas. And you need this because we're at this time where lending is changing, leadership models are changing, donors are disappearing. We're like, how do you trust in trust-based philanthropy? AI, who's scared of AI? I'm terrified of it. There are all these disruptions that are shifting how we do work. And if we're over-indexing on stability and harmony and security, we're not going to bring in those ideas of dissent. One of the things that I'm going to glide over today is there's a model of thinking about how organizations, how people sit in terms of innovation. And there's always people who get really excited about leaping ahead. So if you, hang on. Every time I go over to annotate, I accidentally flip the slide forward. If you imagine where people are in terms of their willingness to change and their willingness to sit through disruption, they're oftentimes like some people over here who have totally leaped ahead. They're all for it. They're ready to go. There's sometimes people that are kind of sitting in the middle, doing the emotional labor or doing the analysis to make sure that we move, with thoughtfulness and analysis. And then there are people that are kind of hanging on to our history, that are taking a stand for our values and our mission. And one of the things I want to say when you're thinking about where people are in response to change is that in this mission mindset mentality, you often have in the nonprofit sector more people that are sitting really strongly in values of history and organization, and it makes it harder to think about how to be disruptive, how to bring dissent. I'm just kind of driving home, nonprofits are culturally different. I did a study with the data with the folks at Team Coaching International, really thinking through this with them, and found some quantitative data to say, yeah, nonprofits are actually different in how they view conflict and their willingness to step in and be supportive of harmony. So you're going to get a version of this if you want to try. This is another one of the resources that's coming today to kind of map out, like, where are your leapers? Where are your tradition holders? Where are the people that are building the bridges? They're all really important for navigating change and conflict, but it's helpful to kind of think about where those people are, because it'll help you more clearly identify what's in the room. And if we have time, I'll come back to this and talk a little more about why this is helpful in thinking about how you bring in conflict. But this is another tool to use in kind of mapping out where your team is and what's likely to show up when you start having conflict. And we take a deep breath. There we go. Just a moment to take a deep breath, because I've been going really fast. So this is probably really one of the hearts of this presentation now, is busting some myths about what we hold on to with conflict. So for me, there are 5 myths about conflict that show up specifically in the nonprofit sector. The first is that conflict is unpleasant. The second is that you will get to great ideas with consensus. The third is that if you prevent conflict, you're supporting your teams. The fourth is about toxicity, and the fifth is about you not having skill. So I'm going to bust these one by one, and I may have already foreshadowed and started to work through a couple of these, but let's take them one by one. So the first is that conflict is unpleasant. And I think the most important thing that we can say here is that unskilled conflict is unpleasant. Unpleasant, unskilled. Those go together. Skilled conflict can be really empowering and beautiful. So again, conflict happens all the time. This is the dinner example. There's like nothing instinctively unpleasant. I mean, it can be, but nothing instinctively unpleasant about how to decide where to go to dinner. Usually you have a pattern, you know what's going to happen, you get to agreement. It's not so bad. But it's unskilled that rocks when we don't know what the rules are, when we don't know how things are going to happen. That's the unpleasant stuff. When it goes into toxic, that's unpleasant. But skilled is empowering and inclusive. The second myth I want to bust is that consensus gets us to the best ideas. So this is what we were talking about just a little bit ago about the importance of dissent, and that we suppress innovation, we suppress ideas if we're not letting, if we're not creating a space to get to conflict. Eventually you need to get to consensus. You have to like decide and let go, but there has to be a space where you don't over-index on cohesion and consensus, that you make space to ruffle a little bit and decide, okay, this is good enough, let's get to consensus and move on. But making sure that you have the right amount of space for your team, for the decision that is at hand, so that you don't suppress really great ideas from coming into the room. So, but this is the data that we talked about a little earlier in the presentation, right? Groups need dissent to have great ideas come forward. The third myth I want to bust, and this is when it starts getting a little harder, is that we tend to think that we're supporting teams by helping them avoid conflict. Oftentimes because we doubt our ability to manage it, or because we're worried that something's going to go wrong with everybody if we let conflict happen. And this often reinforces cultural norms that we as leaders are trying to avoid. And I especially want to talk to those white-faced of us in the room, because this is something that really sits badly in the white supremacy zone, is not trusting the strength of our teams to show up and engage in conflict. They are strong enough. You are not your team's savior. You are trying to challenge them, raise them up, invest in them. And it's true if you're a consultant. It's true if you're a supervisor. It's true whatever kind of leadership you hold in your team, that what you want is to bring up the cultural norm that we can do this. We can build these relationships, and we are strong and creative and generative. Your teams do not need saving. So, yes, I'm just gonna let that one sit for a second. Whew, I always get my heart rate goes up when I say that stuff out loud, and that's okay. But letting conflict rise underneath and kind of sit there, that's where toxicity comes in. It's a myth to think that conflict is what tears your team apart. Toxic conflict might, but so can toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is just as damaging to the team as toxic conflict, and sometimes more, because we ignore it and we tend to pretend that it's not there. You can deteriorate team trust really fast with toxic positivity and really trying to avoid it, and actually lead to resentment and distrust. And if you've ever been the person to have to sit on your hands with a great idea and feel run over because you want to voice something and you don't get to voice it, you know how painful that can be. That disrupts the fiber of an organization as much as anything. Um, the last thing that I want to bust is any thought that you don't have the skill to lead your team through this. I've got some tools that I'm going to share in just a second to think about things as a stair step, because this is like going to the gym. You don't go into the gym and start lifting the heaviest weights. You start with lighter weights and work your way up, and you build consistency over time. And that's when those skills get strong. So I'm going to introduce a couple of lighter things. Spoiler alert, there's an otter involved. But there are ways to step into this to build the skill of your team and your skill as a leader. All right. I feel like it's another deep breath. So hopefully we've busted all of those myths. And you're probably noticing what you held on to. But I want to say Adrienne Marie Brown and Natanya Lee are both really powerful Black queer feminist thinkers, leaders, facilitators. And the concept of principled struggle, lest we think that like letting conflict happen is at odds with trying to work in social justice movements. I wanted to make sure that I checked with voices that weren't mine. And there's a lot of this that comes for those that have read Resilient Nonprofits by Maurice Mitchell. But I love this quote from Adrienne Marie Brown reflecting on Natanya Lee's work in Principled Struggle. We struggle for the sake of deepening our collective understanding and getting to greater unity. There is a purpose here. Innovation, but also the kinds of problems that we are struggling with aren't easy. If they were easy, we would have fixed them by now. They're working at deep-seated social issues, racial issues, economic issues, just all kinds of stuff. And if we can't struggle through them, we're going to be challenged to do this in a way that brings unity. One of the axioms to hold here is that everyone has a truth that is right, at least partially. From the ability of conflict, it allows us to say that like, hey, these truths might seem incompatible, but we have to keep them side by side so that we can honor and appreciate the truth in both of them. They're seemingly incompatible. But as somebody said, like there's a food court here, there's a way. From a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, all of these things that not so worried about what our administration says right now. Inclusion and belonging is really important for healthy organizations. Our truths are different. They're informed by our lived experience. They're unique. And one of the important things about knowing how to hold conflict is that it gives you more capacity to hold all of these different lived experiences and all of these different ways of approaching a problem and bringing in the unique and creative value of everybody on your team. I am not the best thinker or talker on things in the DEI world, but this is one that I really get and hold on to. So just a quick poll that Ivy's going to pop up in a second, poll number 1. I'm really curious which of these myths you think you might be holding on to the most. Just really curious, especially because it's anonymous, like what's challenging you? Just to check in with it. Oh my gosh. People are thinking about this one. I can tell it's taken an extra minute for things to come in because I think people are slowing down and going, oh, yeah, I'm not sure. And this is going to help me figure out which slides to skip over in the next few slides. You're going to get all the slides on the deck, but I might glide over a couple based on what you're telling me here. So, okay. I think that's good enough. We don't quite have everybody, but I think this gives us a good sense. So a lot of folks are still really struggling that conflict is unpleasant. Like more than half, that's 78%, that's a really big challenge. And then the skill question. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get to stuff that helps us think about both what the skill looks like, as well as what makes it, like, how do we navigate our feeling that this can be unpleasant? So you're going to get the slides in order, a little different order of what I'm about to share. But I'm going to start with this slide here. Oh, there we go. There's some work by Patrick Lencioni that's about identifying your team's optimal conflict zone. And you can find, I think, in my list of resources, and if not, I'll make sure I'll share it later. There's a piece about optimal conflict zone. But one thing to think about when you're trying to think of how do I make sure this isn't unpleasant is actually having a conversation about what does artificial harmony, rush to consensus, toxic positivity, how do we know when it's here? Or what does it look like when it's destructive, when it's mean-spirited, when we're attacking each other? When does that happen? What does that look like? So that we can identify what it looks like when we're in the optimal conflict zone. Right? What does it look like when we're doing things that are constructive? How do we know that that's happening? And so I want to make the case that, like, this is a fantastic conversation to have with your teams, to lay this conflict zone idea out so that you can bring teams in and so that you can agree this is what it looks like when we're trying to create it, right? Do voices get raised? What do we do? How long do we let it hang out there? When do we do it? All the time? What kinds of meetings? When do we let this happen? But one of the things that helps keep it in the pleasant, or the zone where it doesn't get into our nervous system and derail us, is actually having a conversation about it so everybody agrees on what it is, right? This is when it's going to happen. This is what we're going to make it look like, and if it doesn't look like this, we stop. And those agreements can be really crucial, and that clarity is really helpful to the nervous system part of what unpleasant conflict looks like. The other tool that I want to kind of bring you into is the concept of polarity thinking. And you're going to get, I'm going to share a template in just a second, but ask people to think about these things don't live in opposition to each other. They actually live in harmony with each other. They live in a cyclical balance together. And so another way to have this conversation with the team, to bring things into the known, to bring things into clarity and predictability, is to build out something called a polarity map. This is the work of Barry Johnson. You can, you're going to get my version, and there's information about Barry Johnson and a link to understand how to fill something like this in. But again, this is something that you do with your team so that the team gets really clear on what's coming down the pike. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? What does it look like? How do we know when we're overemphasizing consensus and positivity, or when we're overemphasizing things that get destructive? And what does the right balance look for us? So I'm not going to go into detail about this tool, but polarity mapping is one of those great tools for stepping into it. The warning signs for toxicity, some of it's going to be drama triangle. Some of it's going to be when you notice things start to get interpersonal or even values-based. Drama triangle, by the way, Karpman, K-A-R-P-M-A-N, the Karpman drama triangle is thinking of things in terms of a hero, a victim, and a villain, rather than a creator, a challenger, and a coach. So there's the drama triangle by Karpman, but these are things I can answer questions about them in the Q&A. I'm going to try to finish in the next 3 minutes, and I want to get to the tools part. But these are things I can go deeper into about what might show up, how to navigate things being really toxic. But what I really want to get to is making sure you know that you can do this. One of the first things that I encourage people to think about is the world's worst. There is a lot of ego attached into offering the right idea. There is very little ego attached to being wrong. And for those that have an improv bend to them, you may have seen this done in improv. It's actually very easy to facilitate. You ask people to design the absolute worst version of something. And they will be so generative, and they will disagree with each other, and they will pile on. If we were to design this thing we're trying to design, if we were to make the worst policy ever for this, what would be wrong with it? Tell me everything. And they will pile on ideas so easy. It's remarkable how easy this feels for people. And then the way that you shift this conversation into useful is say, let's talk about what the other side of all these things is. And people will forget what worst idea they put up there, and they will contribute on top of other people's ideas about the flip side. So if it's not that, then what would be the greatest thing? What's the antidote to that? It's very easy to facilitate. Teams step into it very naturally. It's super playful. Meeting agreements, you can assign a contrarian. You've got a timekeeper, a facilitator, a note taker, a contrarian. Formalize the role of being the person who tries to rock the boat. Make it a normal part of a certain type of project meeting. It's edgy, it's a next step. That's why it's a next step up the chain. When you've normalized that nobody's gonna lose their mind for rocking the boat, you start to bring in this normal role of, we always want to see this in a meeting. We always want to hear it. It's so important. We're going to assign the role, and it rotates. Everybody's got to step into it, and you skill it up. There's also, after that, things like brainstorming, bringing in coaches to really get deep in. Another thing to consider is having a stuffy that gets thrown into the middle of the table. An otter, you ought to be talking. I can't bear that you haven't shared your ideas. Keep those stuffies around so that if somebody else is noticing that you're not speaking, they're going to throw that stuffy into the middle of the room to say, I think there's more here. The bear just jumped on my keyboard to make me go faster. But that idea of bringing a stuffy, doing some things that have lightness to them in the beginning, the important thing is consistency and clarity. Whatever you're going to do, make a practice of doing it often enough and being clear that that's what you're doing. Know that people's nervous systems are at play in all of this. And you probably have other tools that you're going to type into the chat so that I can get to Q&A. You're people that have been at this a while. It's what happens when I rush. You are people that have been at this for a while, and maybe I've said something new, and maybe you've done something that's even better than anything I could offer this group. So don't be shy. I am not afraid of you disagreeing with me, and I want to hear your ideas. I practice what I preach. I'm not afraid of the ideas. Bring them, and feel free to put into chat a tool that you've used with teams that you feel like allowed people to step in with dissent and rock the boat ideas, and let other people benefit from your brilliance. Here we go. So in the email that you get are going to be all of these resources. The piece that I started with at the beginning about relationship systems intelligence, there's a great book about creating intelligent teams by Friedjohn and Rode. Switch by the Heath brothers is one of my favorite books to think about how brains kind of process what it is to go through change. And so it's kind of a useful foundational thing when you're trying to figure out what's happening with your team. The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni is what lays out optimal conflict zone. And if you're thinking about other ideas for how to facilitate teams, The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, there's both a website and a handbook for how to facilitate a lot of different inclusive idea generating meetings. I love that. And again, a reminder, consistency, clarity, and making sure that it ties to values. Before we head into Q&A, I want to make sure you know there's the diagnostic that I talked about at the beginning. If you're really thinking about your team and you want to dig deep into it, There's a version of it called the Team Leader View that I am more than happy to offer to any of you and schedule a free debrief with you to just kind of think about what you might be trying to bring into being with your team. I'm also going to be launching in the next few months a team development grant to work with a cohort of teams, so probably about 6 teams, to bring into a cohort to go through some transformative work. And I'd be happy to put you on the list for when we announce that availability. With that, okay, not enough time for Q&A, but I will do my best to honor stuff. So let me take the slides down, and what can I answer for you?
I'm curious, when you're facilitating, how you address or disarm whatever a bully in the group.
That for me is in the liberating structures piece, because we default to voice, and bullies are used to being able to talk over everybody else. And so when I have a very vocal bully in the room, or somebody who thinks that their ideas land on top, in which is every team for the record, I go to nonverbal input. It's really hard to bullet with dots and sticky notes.
Love that. Thanks.
Yeah, so there are more answers, but voice is their default tool usually. There's a question in the chat about trauma-informed work is so important, but it's hard to know where to start. Nonprofit Learning Lab is a group that I work with a lot, and they have some trauma-informed facilitation stuff. I like that. I will source at least one good read, but I think in terms of knowing where to start, oftentimes it's about being able to ask the question and just say, you know, I need to learn about what it is to be trauma informed here. And people on a team may have different definitions of what that means and different expectations of what that means. So it's often about having a conversation, but always assume that there's trauma in the room. Always assume that if you're trying to be personal, there's a risk of hitting somebody's trigger. Know that there are signals and signs. Silence, disengagement. It may not be trauma, but it's about making space for it. So I'll try to pass on to Ivy to share to the group a good resource, or at least one good read on that. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I saw, there's a anonymous question that came in, or an anonymous share about some leaders are simply going to be conflict averse and feel really challenged when conflicting viewpoints come in the room, and that disagreement is like a challenge to authority, is the way that I hear that. And so I think that when I talked about, and you know, it's a big word to use, right? White supremacist leadership views. Like, it's something that a lot of leaders have to confront, white or otherwise, about. It is totally okay to let people challenge. It's how. It's creating the path and the consistency to how, but knowing that people disagreeing with you is not what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to make sure that it's respectful, that we know when it happens. Give a channel, give a process, make it consistent and clear about how it happens, and it's going to feel less like you're getting whacked in the face by it. But you do have to find, it's a challenge to us as leaders to build our confidence in bringing dissent in the room. Yeah. There's a question in the chat about how do I get groups to focus on task conflict and set aside other categories. It is not easy. That's a lot of the coaching aspect of it that I do. If you notice that the groups tend to default to value stuff, then you do that work first. You do the work on learning about communication styles, or you do the work on how are we going to engage, but you do kind of the restorative work first with the team before trying to lead them into conflict. Let's see. Barb's been watching the chat with me. Did I miss any questions in the chat?
Not to this point. You've done a great job, Betsy, of keeping up with it all.
I'm gonna take
Yes.
yeah.
And since we are getting close, if anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll see if Betsy is able to answer them. Otherwise, I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping items. We have 6 events to look forward to in September, and we hope that you will join us for those. One that we really want to push is we do have a social hour on September 25th that we would love for you to just come hang out, get to know some of our staff, some of our United Way Next members. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone that joined today and those of you that are watching the recording, as well as a special shout out to both Betsy and Barb. We couldn't put on these sessions without incredible volunteers like you. And then there will be, once you guys end the call and hop out of Zoom, a like 3 or 4 question survey just to make sure that we are throwing the best events that we can for you guys and just giving you the best member experience. So if you wouldn't mind taking 30 to 45 seconds to fill that out, it would be greatly appreciated.